Well, wonderful. I'm Jim Goldgeier, co-director of Bridging the Gap, which is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Frankel Family Foundation. Bridging the Gap provides training and support for scholars who want to engage public and policy audiences. And we partner with Oxford University Press on the Bridging the Gap book series, which publishes academically rigorous policy relevant books. We are proud to launch our 6th book and latest in the series, Adaptation Under Fire, How Militaries Change in Wartime, authored by General David Barno and Dr. Nora Bensahel. General Barno is a visiting professor of strategic studies and senior fellow at the Merrill Center of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a contributing editor and columnist for War on the Rocks and an adjunct research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses. Dr. Bensahel is a visiting professor of strategic studies and senior fellow of the Merrill Center at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, also a contributing editor and columnist for War on the Rocks, an adjunct research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses, and she also serves as a member of the Secretary of Defense's Reserve Forces Policy Board. We were originally scheduled to hold this book roundtable at the International Studies Association annual meeting in Hawaii in March, but alas, that meeting was not held, and here we are on Zoom. I'm very grateful that our scheduled ISA distinguished panelists agreed to join us here. They are in alphabetical order: Dr. Richard A. Lacquement, Jr., Research Professor of National Security Affairs at the Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute; Dr. Karl Mueller, Senior Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation; and Dr. Kori, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Our authors will present first, followed by comments from our distinguished panel, and then we look forward to questions from our audience. We're thrilled that so many of you have signed up, and I know that there's at least one former research assistant who signed up for this, so we look forward to your questions. Catherine Urban will be monitoring them. Feel free to submit them either via the chat or Q&A functions, and we will acknowledge you by name if we're able to address your question, unless you note that you would prefer to remain anonymous. The conversation is being recorded and will be made available for viewing at the Bridging the Gap website. So Nora and Dave, congrats again on this amazing book, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Jim, and thanks to all of our panelists for their stalwart sticking with the program, even though we're not in sunny Honolulu, Hawaii right now. And so we're looking forward to a great discussion today with a few comments up front by Nora and I on kind of the scope of the book, and then some thoughts from our panelists. Then, as Jim noted, turning it over to questions from the audience out there. So this book is a long-term project for us. It's been several years in the making, and it was originally driven by a course that we were teaching first at Georgetown University, later at American, and now at Johns Hopkins SAIS on military adaptation. We realized after we taught the course the first time that there's a book in this, and that this is an underserved subject in many ways. And having spent 3+ decades of my adult life in the military, I was keenly aware of how much the military is constantly preparing for conflicts, how much time it takes in training and in readiness and getting the right force structure, doing all the things in anticipation of what future wars and conflicts are going to look like. But as Secretary of Defense Bob Gates used to regularly say, that the U.S. has a perfect track record, at least since the end of the Vietnam War, of never getting the next war right, never once getting it right. And so the reality is all those preparations in some ways are for naught if, when the war comes and it looks different than what was expected, you can't adapt to the war you actually have. But military still have to plan. They still have to draw up budgets. They still have to project what kind of weaponry they need and buy that weaponry and get it out there on airfields and in motor parks, make sure it's kept maintained, train people how to use it. They have to develop ways of fighting in advance of not knowing what that future war is going to look like. The doctrine that they work so hard on and they spend so much time practicing and honing before that next unknown war breaks out. And they have to put an entire system of developing military leaders in place as well. They've got a huge amount of responsibility in peacetime to anticipate what's going to happen and to make bets, as it were, on the roulette wheel of what the next war will actually unfold as, well in advance of knowing that after the first battle. So given the military has done, U.S. military and others have done quite badly at that. We failed to predict 9/11, reaching back in time, we failed to predict Pearl Harbor. More recently, we've failed to predict the Russian invasion of Crimea. We've not done well in really anticipating what the next conflict is going to be. But as famous British military historian Michael Howard once said, it's perhaps less important to get it right and to recognize that you'll get some fundamental aspects of the next war wrong. What's really important is the capacity to get it right when the moment arrives, to be able to adapt to the war you have, not the one that you were anticipating. So in other words, militaries have got to really hone the ability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances that are going to characterize certainly those first battles of the next war and perhaps the entire conflict from front to back. So given the impossibility of predicting future conflicts, we ask the question, what should the military be doing to prepare for those conflicts, since they aren't really foreseeable in a lot of different ways? And we have two thoughts there. One is that militaries have to continue to plan. There's no question that you still have to make decisions about what kind of force structure you're going to have, how you're going to deploy your forces, what you're going to equip them with. And that planning has value in and of itself to prepare for whatever exigency might actually unfold in the next conflict. But more importantly, we suggest that militaries need to become much more adaptable. Every war reveals the unexpected in the opening battles. We find outmoded tactics or underperforming weapons. We find flawed strategies and leaders that are inflexible in the face of changing conditions. Inevitably, the first battles of any future war bring disruptive shocks that militaries then have to adjust to if they're going to ultimately prevail. And so we would argue that the most important attribute in many respects for a military that's going to have confidence, is going to have the ability, is going to have a reasonable expectation to prevail in future wars, isn't necessarily just readiness, isn't training, isn't building a professional education system. It's being adaptable and instilling adaptability into the force so that those dramatic adjustments can be made when the war breaks out. We actually coined a term called the adaptation gap. And we argue that the adaptation gap is the delta, if you will, between what the next war is expected to look like, which we could think about as the 12 o'clock point or midnight on a clock face, and the actual war itself, which might be more at like 2 or 3 o'clock when war unfolds. And we argued in the past that gap between expected war at midnight and the real war at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock was not immense, was not significant. But we're now seeing, because of a number of factors I'm going to briefly mention, that gap is growing. The adaptation gap is going from not simply 2 or 3 o'clock off midnight, but all the way to 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or even beyond. And there's a number of reasons why we think the adaptation gap is growing, and why we would argue, therefore, it's even more important for militaries to get much, much better at adaptation than simply being ready for a conflict that they predict but know they're going to get wrong. So there's several areas that we think that the current era, looking ahead the next several decades, is going to bring to us that require the U.S. military to become more adaptable. First is that this is a period of great strategic uncertainty. We're seeing status quo powers and rising powers in conflict. We're seeing nothing like the predictability that I grew up with in most of my time in the military during the Cold War. And we're seeing the rise of gray zone competitions that are actually below the threshold of war, that engage not only nation states, but non-state actors. That this strategic uncertainty is going to make adaptability in the next conflict far more important and make it much more difficult to predict what that conflict will look like. We see wars leaping out of their conventional boundaries. In the past, the domains of air, land, and sea were for decades, centuries, in some cases, the norms that we could expect wars to be fought on. Today, we have space and cyberspace at a minimum, new domains that have not experienced all-out warfare before, in which it's extremely difficult to predict how warfare in those domains will unfold and how they'll affect the other domains of air, land, and sea. We see that we're in a time of exponential change. It's moving at incredibly accelerated rates. And there's been lots of ink spilled on this, lots of books written about this. But the reality is that we're seeing technological change being brought on more rapidly and being accessible to much larger swaths of the global population than ever before. It took 38 years for radio to reach 50 million people in the world. It took 1 year for Facebook to achieve the same outcome. So this rapid pace of change and the rapid onset of new technologies is going to really make it extremely difficult to think about how that's going to impact warfare. And then there's a rapid military technological transformation taking place at the same time. New weapons, from hypersonics to autonomous swarming drones to robotics to cyber weapons, directed energy capabilities out there, and then the advent of quantum computing and AI, how those affect warfare and command and control and the delivery of weapons is unknown. And so all of these taken collectively suggest that this adaptation gap between what war is as we expect it and what war is going to actually look like is growing significantly. It's a boundaryless potential battlefield out there, which will range from the depths of the ocean to the edge of outer space, to your home and your pocket and your pocketbook with your cell phone in it, because it will reach out and touch all of us at home as well. A very challenging conflict to have to think about if you were the leaders of the U.S. military. So fundamentally, the central question of our book is the U.S. military adaptable enough to prevail in these kinds of wars of the 21st century? And to help answer that and to give you a little bit more insight on our book is I'll turn it over to Nora and let her talk about how we structured it and then some insights on some of our conclusions.
Great, thank you very much, Dave, and thank you again to the rest of the panelists and the audience for joining us today. We set out to answer that fundamental question: is the US military adaptable enough for the challenges of the 21st century? And we did it by dividing the book into 3 parts. The first part examines what we mean by adaptability. We have to define our terms first. And we develop a framework in there that identifies what we think are the 3 most important elements of an adaptable military. We examine adaptability in terms of doctrine as our first factor, which is how a military fights, how it decides it's going to fight on the future battlefield. Second, in terms of technology, and the technology at 2 different levels. First, at the tactical level, which is how troops on the battlefield use technologies that they already have and need to adapt them for unexpected purposes once the war breaks out and it evolves. And then the second, at the institutional level, not so much having troops on the front lines adapting, but how the military institution, how flexible it is and how rapidly it can generate new kinds of technology for those unforeseen battlefield challenges. So first, doctrine. Second, technology, and then third, leadership. We also break that into 2 different levels. Tactical leadership involves those who are responsible for fighting and winning on the battlefield, usually up to about the colonel level or senior NCO level. And then, theater leadership, the generals who craft and conduct campaigns, usually the most senior person located in the theater of war, who has the most responsibility at the operational level, although of course theater commanders also have strategic responsibilities as well. The rest of the first part 1 of our book illustrates how we use doctrine, technology, and adaptability, doctrine, technology, and leadership to analyze adaptability using examples from the 20th century. We start with World War I, go through World War II, Vietnam, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and the invasion of Grenada as our examples to illustrate what we mean by adaptability and how we develop that framework. The second part of the book, and it's the largest chunk of the book, analyzes US military adaptability in the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm happy to discuss this more in Q&A, so I'm just going to give a very brief summary of some of our findings. In general, we found that at the tactical level, adaptability was fairly impressive, often quite impressive. For example, Apache helicopter pilots, a helicopter that was designed for an attack mission, adapted their tactics to provide close air support in the early days of the war in Afghanistan, something that the aircraft was not built for, and represented an incredible adaptation during this conflict. And also at the tactical level in terms of leadership, in Iraq, then Colonel Sean McFarland implementing an effective counterinsurgency strategy in Ramadi that helped turn the tide of the Iraq war in a very important way. So at the tactical level, adaptation was often quite good. At the institutional and theater levels, however, there were abysmal failures. For example, the US Army refused to allow its soldiers to use intelligence software by a commercial company called Palantir, even though the Marines had used it effectively and it was demonstrated to save the lives of soldiers in combat. The Army basically never allowed its soldiers to use that on a systematic basis because it threatened the system that the Army bureaucratically preferred, which is known as DCIGS-A. So to protect an existing system didn't incorporate software that clearly would have saved lives. And at the leadership level from Iraq, General George Casey's almost 4-year tenure as the theater commander in Iraq, who did a number of things that seemed to promote counterinsurgency, but never reevaluated his fundamental assumptions that undermined the very principles of a counterinsurgency campaign, even as the metrics got demonstrably worse on every single dimension throughout the Iraq War, throughout the first 4 years of the Iraq War. So a very mixed picture, depending on what level you look at of adaptability in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Finally, the third part of the book turns back to that question: is the US military adaptable enough for the 21st century? And this is where we argue that the answer to that question may well be no. After discussing some of the challenges of future war and the adaptation gap that Dave just mentioned, we then assess the current state of US military adaptability in each of our 3 areas, in the areas of doctrine, technology, and leadership, and find numerous areas of concern. In the area of doctrine, there's often excessive amounts of doctrine, and the processes for revising it are way too slow to keep up with the needs of an ever-changing and adapting battlefield. In the area of technology, we find that there are very deep structural tensions between the combatant commands, which prioritize the needs of those who are fighting today, and the services, which prioritize needs for the future. And in the area of leadership, we argue, for example, that too much risk aversion, especially when in garrison, when not deployed on operations, is posing a real threat to leadership adaptability. And we highlight a number of problems with professional military education as well. The final chapter of the book provides many specific recommendations for improvements in each of these areas. There are a lot of recommendations. I'll just highlight a couple. We recommend adopting adaptability as a principle of war, which would put more emphasis on it and lead it to be incorporated in more military training and exercises. We recommend revitalizing and resourcing organizations that were developed to promote rapid adaptation, many of which, after they were formed, become smaller in power when when a transition occurs and new people take over the service, and tend to put them back in their bureaucratic place, rather that enables them, taking away what enables them to innovate effectively. We recommend strengthening mission command, the principle of decentralization, and encouraging commanders at the lowest levels to take initiative, because much of what is going on in today's garrison culture undermines that. And we recommend sending more officers to civilian senior schooling so that they can expose their ideas to people from very different backgrounds and can understand a bit more and think more deeply about some of the topics that help with creative thinking and decision-making under pressure than they can in primarily all military learning environments. So those are just a couple of the examples of the recommendations. We have plenty more, and we're happy to talk about them as the discussion goes on. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim to get our discussion started.
Great, thank you both so much. Oh, I wish I could take your class. Richard, over to you.
Thank you all, and thanks for including me in the panel. And I'm sorry we couldn't do this in Hawaii and then go sit on the beach afterwards or whatever. Now, first I have to put a disclaimer out that the opinions I'm expressing here do not represent those of the Army War College, the Department of Defense, or any part of the U.S. government. That said, it was an excellent book. I really enjoyed it. Congratulations on getting it out there. I think it's a great contribution to the debates about adaptation, with compelling examples, spirited critique, and very thoughtful, practical suggestions for how the U.S. military, and really the Army in particular, can do better. Now, I have to admit, you had me at artillery porn on the cover, so I really appreciate that, especially since one of you is actually an infantry background type. But it was also further reinforced when I got into it. One of my favorite accounts of leadership, particularly at the theater level, is the defeat into victory. Field Marshal Sir William Slim and what he did in Burma. So anybody who uses that as one of their setup cases is obviously on the right track. So I really appreciate that. And I'm going to circle back to that a little bit later as I wrap up. Very heartening part is really the sort of tremendous flexibility and adaptability we see frequently amongst the junior officers and soldiers. And it's not that, and we see some of it at the higher levels, but unfortunately, I think that, as you summarize, is probably a more disheartening part of the story. The frequent difficulties operationally, strategically, and that includes the institutional level where military leaders, usually general officers, have demonstrated failures of adaptation that have been particularly damaging. So I think, and like I said, I wanted to emphasize that it more than just that theater level. I appreciate what you did with institutional level. And I'm going to come back to this sort of, what happens when you get to that level. And in fact, institutionally, we're still talking about general officers. It's like we're in theater, it's Casey and it's McKiernan. In institutional, General Leger with the G2 and Palantir, and several others, usually unnamed in those bigger processes for acquisition, such as with the MRAPs, are really sort of the crux of this. So if there's a sense of that, if there's a failure of generalship as a theme in terms of where the problems lie that need more attention. But there is one area I'd like to highlight and maybe suggest not so much a critique, as a bit of reframing that I think is important. And it's this distinction between profession and bureaucracy. And it's really partly you start out your literature kind of in organizational theory. And oftentimes that tends to get to, large bureaucracies, other organizations, businesses that are similar. But I have been sort of come around to this idea that where we need to spend more time thinking from the sociology standpoint on kind of the system of professions, the ways in which they compete with each other, and the ways that large organizations that always have a bureaucracy can still be a profession. The question is, can professions avoid being just a bureaucracy? And can they ensure that they are actually applying expert judgment on behalf of society, those who create professions and validate professions, to do what needs to be done? And I find that oftentimes, if I were to reframe a lot of what I saw there, the successes tend to be where you see better uses of discretionary professional judgment, expertise that the military has developed, either at junior levels and even senior levels, like when you use General Petraeus, for example, and the Counterinsurgency Manual, where you see this sort of recognition of, yes, we have a large organization, and whereas existing doctrine sort of represents the bureaucracies or the profession's answer to some problems that have now been sort of codified a bit as guidance, how do you recognize when you're confronted with a new problem where the sort of responses you've come up with in the past aren't the right ones? And so it's not to say that bureaucracy isn't valuable and that well-established routines don't need to be followed, but how do you know when they're not fixed, not working, when you have hypotheses that should lead you to success and the evidence isn't bearing you out, as you suggest in the Casey example. But I think that's captured a little bit better, and really that's kind of the sociologist Andrew Abbott, the system of professions, kind of translated into the military world, I think pretty well by Don Snyder and the projects that he's done. And there it really is about sort of how do you understand that expertise in what jurisdictions? And that's more than just conventional war. That's stability operations. That's where counterinsurgency is. That's where homeland security. And so it's a lot more than just combat. That's really the profession is about. And really sort of opens up the point of, if you're not attaining security and you have a role to play, do you need to do something different? I think that's where you can now also bring attention to cyber and space issues a little more easily. So going sort of, when I look at sort of the things you've laid out there, I have a little bit different take. One of the other things your title meant to me when I first saw it, and I believe strongly that, there's, in the renewed emphasis on great power competition and the importance, the importance of, new challenges in space and cyberspace, but there's also sort of there's a cumulative nature of the military profession. The idea that air, sea, and land things haven't gone away. And as the Taliban and other opponents have demonstrated, it doesn't take a lot of technology or sophistication to create challenges for us. That essentially what we're identifying is an accumulation of more responsibilities, more areas of expertise, more ways that we have to be adaptive. And if I worry about some of the adaptations you did identify, sort of some of the things being done with doctrine, Army Futures Command, Security Force Assistance Brigades, and some of the educational advancements that have been made in PME and in training, that those things may come under fire if the answer becomes kind of like the post-Vietnam War. We just want to go back to that comfortable conventional box where we know we're really good and stay there and sort of ignore some of these more messy things. Fine, you'll leave those to somebody else. So coming back to, I think you have great recommendations. I think particularly the ones on education speak to me, unsurprisingly, as the way you get at this, and that you've rightly identified leadership as the dominant one here. That really the core expertise, as I see it in the military profession for officers, is leadership. of a large organization, that profession, to do what society needs. So the ways you've gone through that to include, shepherding some of these nascent initiatives, that's probably too early to tell, but we should continue to push. And some of the other ones in terms of talent management, education, acquisition, things about data literacy, I think are excellent, excellent ideas that apply both to civilians and military. And I will put down a little bit marker over to the side. I am a big fan of advanced civil schooling and more civil education, but not in lieu of professional military education. In other words, a supplement to it, not a substitute for it. There really are, the profession is responsible for developing its knowledge for what it needs to do. And I think there's valuable things to learn from civilians, but we shouldn't outsource it completely. And I'm not saying that you said that, but just one that I want to sort of leave a little bit different balance in there that you may have. But I want to circle back to Field Marshal Slim. One of his my favorite quotes is from his wrap up on those afterthoughts. This idea that the preparation, I'm quoting him, the preparation for war is an expensive, burdensome business. Yet there's one important part that costs little: study. However changed and strange the new conditions of war may be, not only generals, but politicians and ordinary citizens may find there's much to be learned from the past that can be applied to the future. So I would wrap up my comments, but then if I may, we didn't say about whether we could leave some questions on the table. I want to leave 3 quick questions on the table. You can take them or leave them. But a great analysis, found it very powerful. As I said, I particularly concur with your emphasis on leadership and the importance of education as a way to improve adaptability and the exercise of discretionary judgment. Now, the 3 questions, I kind of in decreasing order of importance, and in other words, the highest one first. One is sort of made push on that. How do you know when you successfully created an adaptable individual organization in advance? You gave great examples of ones that we've seen. They actually demonstrated it, but how do you see that in advance? The second one was just, what are the other elements of adaptability besides doctrine, technology, and leadership did you consider but decided weren't as important, and why? Maybe what was the 4th one on the list if you were doing more? And then the last one, just a quick one, maybe more for General Barno. The Abazade story sort of hung in the background. You gave me as an example of tactical leadership adaptability, and he's Casey's boss as a 4-star in Iraq. I get it. He's not the theater commander you focused on, but he's kind of in the background. And I'm kind of wondering, between Grenada and Iraq and Afghanistan, that tactical versus operational strategic adaptability, and how you might assess that. But I'll go ahead and stop there. But really, brilliant book. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. Karl, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for including me in this. I agree with Richard that this is an outstanding book. I'm glad to be here to sing its praises, and congratulations to Nora and Dave on finally getting this out amidst the challenges of the current period. The book really won me over right from the start with this the distinction, and I realize that this existed already in the literature between peacetime innovation and wartime adaptation. I think this kind of resonated because throughout our lives, my wife and I have sort of conceived of our life as one that consists of alternating periods in which there wasn't enough money to do what we wanted to do and there wasn't enough time to do what we wanted to do. And I guess COVID is sort of like that as well, right? Some of us are in the position of having a lot of free time on our hands, we're having trouble to fill, and not much, and not a lot of resources to fill it with. And then there's those of us who are spending a great deal of time getting very little sleep, working from home, and homeschooling, and not having time to do the binge watching. As you can tell which group I'm in, because I'm still sporting a cartoon version of my high school haircut at the moment. I apologize for that. So 10 minutes isn't very long. I'll just hit a few quick points, and I'm afraid they will not be as connected as I'd like. I want to start from the point that Nora and Dave raise in the introduction, where they talk about why the book is scoped down to just focusing on land power. Obviously, it's really smart to keep your project focused and narrow, as we all tell our graduate students on every occasion. And I think that intuitively they are probably right about most of the things they say about innovation in land warfare relative to innovation and adaptation in other military domains. But where they note that they'll leave discussion of applying their framework to naval and air warfare to others, I want to take up that tasker just for a moment, because I think their framework does apply very well to the air power arena, which is one I'll talk about. And I think it's one that really matters for the United States when we're thinking about the overall national security enterprise. right? It's certainly true, as they suggest, that wars are decided ultimately on the ground in almost every case. But for the United States, obviously, in recent years in particular, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're decided on the ground by U.S. troops, right? If we can, we like to kind of lead from above and let others do the combat on the ground while we provide air power and other sorts of things that sound more fun and less bloody to us. Or else try to do as much from the air as we can before we send in the army to do the sort of the decisive close combat stuff, right? And this can lead to relatively prolonged air wars, like Operation Inherent Resolve against ISIS, which went on for 4.5 years, or possibly better characterized as about 3 years before they were really whipped, in months-long campaigns in places like Serbia and Libya. Where there's plenty of opportunity and plenty of demand for wartime adaptation under fire, even if the conflicts tend to be less prolonged than the really stretched out counterinsurgency warfare. You go back and look at the sort of the canonical history of air power that you get in your Air Power 101 class in a staff college or on the History Channel, back when the History Channel actually did history. I don't know if they still do. And it's very much a story about sort of episodes of successful and unsuccessful adaptation under fire, right? Starting back from the competitive development during World War I of air combat and almost all the other functions that modern air power does in the early days. The World War II stories about shifts from unescorted to escorted bombing by the United States, development of close air support and sort of its modern incarnation, the success of U.S. carrier aviation and use of air power for anti-submarine warfare to win the Battle of the Atlantic, and all these sorts of things. You get it even in the Cold War, which isn't a wartime adaptation period, but is one in which nuclear strategy is being developed in the early days, at least, under conditions that are pretty emergency-like. So they are characterized by that combination of a great sense of urgency and relatively lavish resources to try to solve problems that nobody's really sure how to solve. Vietnam is like this, the Gulf War, with the innovations about tank linking and precision strategic attack, and so it had this quality. And going back to the most recent air war against ISIS, you see really interesting innovations like the emergence of strike cells to coordinate the use of air power in support of the ground war, which in fact is a very consequential and still hotly debated air power innovation, but it's largely an Army innovation for the use of air power from the adjacent services. Dave and Nora suggest that adaptation, it tends to be easier for air power than inland warfare, and intuitively I think this tends to be true. Part of it is probably that air power is less driven by doctrine, especially formal doctrine. Airmen are notoriously unenthusiastic about doctrine or anything else that involves reading long documents. Although that hasn't always been true. You think about things like the strategic bombing doctrine that was developed during the interwar period was a very powerful article of faith for airmen during World War II that had to be kind of wrestled to the ground. Air power probably has some advantages in terms of bottom-up innovation that are associated, as the authors suggest, with having a smaller number of people on the front line who have to implement the innovation. But you can argue, I think, that one of the developments that we're seeing in the contemporary period is sort of a shift in that, right? As air bases increasingly become vulnerable to enemy attack through development of long-range missile technology and that sort of thing, you can arguably, and I think probably would be correct to do so, that in a lot of future conflicts, it's increasingly going to be the case that a very large number of the airmen are more or less on the front line, and that the traditional notion that the bulk of the really important air power stuff is what's done by the relatively small number of platforms and the relatively small number of air crew operating them in the cockpits is going to seem somewhat obsolescent. I think you can also make an argument that in air wars, there tends to be a relatively large adaptation gap relative to ground war, just simply because the technologies are less mature than they have generally been in land warfare. And so there's greater opportunity for people's expectations, not only to be wrong, but just to have been overtaken by events. I can think of a lot of examples where the air war turned out to really be very different than was expected before the war, relative to the number and the magnitude of the cases where that's been true for ground warfare. But of course, we need to keep in mind that this, in some ways, sort of an artificial distinction between the domains and the services. Right, warfare is very joint, and especially in non-counterinsurgency warfare, which tends to be sort of uniquely land power dominated, because it involves having conversations with people in a way that many other forms of warfare don't. And this raises questions about the idea of multi-service adaptations, which is I think would be an interesting place to extend this discussion. I mean, even going back to the lovely case about the failures of the Army armor and tank destroyer innovations in the early days of World War II. Ultimately, the solution to that, or a big part of the solution to that, was the joint adaptation of developing effective close air support capabilities. Right? They never got the Sherman to stand up to a Panther's main gun, but there were some impressive adaptive solutions to the problem of the Panthers being on the roads in the first place to interfere with the Allied advances. So time's winding down. Let me talk a little bit about prescription stuff. So I really, like Richard, former military educator in my case, and so I really like the emphasis on educating warfighters to be adaptive. And the effort that Dave and Nora put into trying to sort of explain the necessity for adaptation, or the nature of adaptation being built on the foundation of the sort of what's in the brains of the military personnel that you have, rather than the material preparations for the conflict. And they've got a great list of sort of useful implementable policy measures to take. I think you could add to that list recommendations for sort of cross-domain and cross-service exchange tours and that sort of thing. This is something that we don't see nearly as much of as we might. There's real benefits in spending some time immersed in another service or in the service of another country that goes beyond sort of the substance, but beyond sort of knowing how to work across those boundaries, and just in terms of broadening by experiencing life amidst people who are different from you in much the same way that grad school does. And so, speaking of grad school, one final rant as my time is running out here. So Adaptation Under Fire says we really need to prioritize education, talks about the advantages of grad schools in the civilian world, particularly good real grad schools in the civilian world. It's worth keeping in mind, I think, that one of the reasons that we don't see more of this going on is a lack of time, to go back to that not having enough time versus not having enough money thing. U.S. officer careers in the military haven't gotten longer since the 1950s, even though civilian retirement ages have been rolling back. Even though war has become more complicated, there's more and more tickets that you have to punch on your way to being a general officer in your career, and less sort of slack in your schedule. And this really represents a serious problem. Back when I was in the PME world, we used to send the best and brightest students from our elite best and brightest program, given the opportunity to apply for a PhD program, and be sent there at the Air Force's expense. And the first question we would ask them during the interviews is, are you sure you want to go get a PhD, even though it might well mean that you never become a general as a result? And we shouldn't have to ask that question. And so, if we're really going to make this important, this may ultimately hinge into a significant degree on some fundamental reform of the personnel system, which is a very heavy lift, but one worth making. Okay, I've run over, so I'm going to stop there and hand it back to you, Jim.
Great. Thanks so much, Karl. And Kori, over to you. Need to unmute.
Whoops, sorry. Speaking of training for technological innovation and leadership failures. So I love this book, and I love that we're focused on this book, because I fear the American military is at risk of institutional rot. And every time I hear a Secretary of Defense chest-thumpingly say we have the greatest military in the history of the world, a jihadist gets their IED trigger wings, right? We're really good at what we're good at, And as a result, nobody's going to be dumb enough to fight us the way we're good at, right? Like the 91 Gulf War is the huge anomalous experience, whereas Jim Mattis says you get the great advantage of an unadaptive adversary. But that's not been our experience of war since. And I think the book does a really nice job of helping us to think systemically about how do we create a more innovative and more adaptive military. I'm sad that the Army's Training and Doctrine Command and the proliferation of centers of excellence for this and that are not dealing with this systemic problem, because I actually think it's so much more valuable to focus on this than to have students exploring whether the character of war is changing or the nature of war is changing, which brings to mind theological debates of the Middle Ages with just about as much applicability to the problem that we are trying to solve. I agree with Richard that we see an enormous amount of innovation at the tactical level. And the question is, why don't we see it at the higher level? And should we, right? Like, there is an argument to be made that, that American warfare is so sophisticated in its execution that in order to master, for example, the challenges that a brigade commander has integrating air, logistics, mobility, fires, and infantry is about the bandwidth that is manageable and nothing more, right? You're going to occasionally get a John Buford, but you can't build an army under the expectation that everybody's going to be John Buford, because that's not the nature of your personnel system. And so one of the questions I really struggled with is Alan Antovin's old question from the 1960s. How much innovation is enough? And as I was reading the book, I went back and forth on this. So I'd love to hear Dave and Nora's answers, because on the one hand, I think the answer is at the higher echelons of our military, we need a lot more innovative thinking. But on the other hand, it seems to me that the right criticism of our strategy in Afghanistan is that we haven't had a strategy for Afghanistan. We've had 19 different strategies for Afghanistan, and we seesaw back and forth depending on who you put in charge in one-year increments. So I'd love to hear you think about, how do we know how much is enough on stability for producing strategic outcomes versus innovation necessary to keep the force agile and not suffering for institutional dry rot? It seems to me that our military is not being nearly clear enough on what is the problem we are solving. And I think our challenge as scholars of the military enterprise is helping them get a really clear one-sentence answer to that question. Not a statement of intent, here's what we are going to do. And oh my God, we focused too narrowly on counterinsurgency, and now we're bad at fighting peer competitors. I think that's the question that the 2017 National Defense Strategy suggests, but it's not clear to me, reading through some of the service strategies and talking to some of the folks developing them, that that's the only problem they think they're solving. And so clarity in the problem statement really matters. And I'd love to hear Nora and Dave's one-sentence guidance to what is the problem you need to solve. I'm myself very much influenced by the work of Charles O'Reilly, who's the chair for institutional innovation in the Stanford Business School. And he studied hundreds of cases of why successful organizations are bad at adaptation. And his answer is because being good at adaptation means letting go of what you're doing and setting sail on uncharted seas. And successful organizations are colossally bad at letting go of what they're already good at. I love the fact that when Gary Roughhead was chief of naval operations, he had on the wall as you walked into his office the court-martial papers for Lieutenant Chester Nimitz. Nimitz was court-martialed for running a ship aground and was exonerated by the court-martial, not because they didn't think it was his fault, but because they thought he learned something interesting and important from running a ship aground. And it's impossible to imagine a lieutenant outrunning that rap sheet in our modern Navy. We have become so risk averse in who we permit to perk into our senior ranks that, in my judgment, it's actually personnel policy that is at fault for our innovation failures. We are choosing people that allow the elite to replicate itself. And the elite itself is not particularly innovative once they get beyond the tactical level. Moreover, not that many of them are willing to be Lieutenant Ellis and to acknowledge that you're never going to get promoted, but by God, you're going to write this reckless political assistant secretary of the Navy and argue that continuous aim gunfire produces a 385% increase in accuracy, and the Navy's too stupid to adopt it because they don't know what Navy captains will do if they don't have to maneuver a ship so carefully, right? How do you bring Chester Nimitz's along, and how do you create the space for Lieutenant Ellis? Walt Whitman writes that wisdom cannot be passed from one who has it to one who does not have it. And I pretty much think the same is true of innovation. And it may also be true of leadership. You can refine extant leadership and you can encourage innovative people, but I'm not sure you could create them. And so as I was reading your recommendations about teaching innovation, I'm not sure the schoolhouse is going to have any role in that, unless it's to show them Nimitz's court-martial and Ellis being willing to end his career. Where I do think we're making progress in chipping away at elite replication is in the experimentation the Army has underway for, is it battalion or brigade commanders that they're picking right now? Major General J.P. McGee and his team, I think I haven't seen an undertaking as honest about where institutional bias actually lays and trying to, for example, scrubbing names and genders off of files, putting people behind screens so you can't actually see if she's a little heavy through the hips and whether that doesn't meet your version of what a commander should look like. We really, really need to push that piece of it forward if we are going to get past pretending we care about mission command and actually pulling our own Guderians forward. The one hopeful sign, and which is the last challenge I'll raise, is I remember during the start of the Iraq War when the British were still so incredibly patronizing that some British brigadier wrote a journal article about how the American military was too stupid to fight counterinsurgencies. And that's actually the really hopeful sign about the American military, and in particular about the Army, because the American Army mostly thinks they're bad at their job, and the Chief of Staff and that humility is their saving grace. The Chief of Staff of the Army had parameters publish that article, and that British brigadier got exactly the right punishment, which is, I'm sure he was buried alive under Command and General Staff College essays about how right he is and how much the Army needs to do differently. The last thing I would say is that I think it's worth considering whether the reason we are always bad at things is that it's the nature of the wars we fight and the sophistication of our operations, that who besides us would try and turn on a dime in the space of 3 or 4 years from 20 years of counterinsurgency to fighting a China that's superior to us and having to think again about broken back warfare. That it may actually be that we're always bad at it because we're trying to do a whole bunch of things and we don't have the luxury of specializing. And that's why what Dave and Nora have done is so important, because if you can't specialize, your actual expertise has to be adaptation.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kori. Thanks to all of our panelists. So a number of great comments and questions from the panelists. We have some questions from the audience, and Dave and Nora, what you'll see as we go through them is that they will give you an opportunity to add in responses to Richard, Karl, and Kori. So you don't need to respond directly to them right now. I will be asking the questions of Dave and Nora, but if other panelists would like to chime in, please don't hesitate to get my attention. So the first question came in as you began your remarks, Dave, and while I think you answered it in your remarks, it might be worth adding on to it. So Hannah Dennis at the beginning said, as we've learned, uncertainty is a permanent fixture in planning for future war. Would you assert that we are experiencing or entering an era of unprecedented uncertainty, and why? Now, in your remarks, you mentioned the level of strategic uncertainty, the expansion of the number of domains, and technological change, all of which has occurred in the past. So can you say what it is about the present and future that you find even more alarming from an uncertainty standpoint than past eras when, air power was introduced, or, submarine warfare became important, or the level of strategic uncertainty after the Second World War, those types of periods?
Sure. I think that I would argue that what we're seeing, this combination of all these factors today, is not replicated in history. That's not what we saw in 1911, or, it's not what we saw in 1946. And part of that is speed, is the amount of change that's happening so rapidly that's, encroaching every corner of society, and the amount of disruption that's bringing with it. I think, just to take one small example, the advent of the cyber domain relative to any other domain of warfare, to include the air domain, which is the most recent in effect, that it's had a big influence on how wars are fought. The cyber domain is a great unknown. It's not just a great unknown because we haven't fought a war in that domain. It's a great unknown because in this country and in most advanced countries, every element of your society rides on a cyber framework, and every element of your society can be touched by cyber attacks. And so you're now in a position where, in effect, it's like the advent of air power. Your adversary has got long-range bombers, and you have no air force, or your air force can't protect every single village, every single town, every single industry in the country. So that alone, just the cyber domain, much less reliance on space and other things, I think is pushing us to have to rethink how we defend the nation against wars that we have normally defended by physical defenses, usually for deployed fleets and aircraft in Europe and in the Pacific. That's not even relevant when we're talking about cyber. And so again, I wanted to make that the dominant part of the conversation, but that and all the cascading effects that surround that we're seeing in all parts of business and governments, and societies, it's a different environment, and it's one that's moving a lot faster. So I think the likelihood is we're going to see a big shift from what's expected in the next war, much more so than we would have seen in any past adaptation period.
Yeah, my initial answer to that would be exactly what he said, which is speed, which is new, and two new domains of war that we don't have any history of war fighting in. You know, that is a big challenge. But I would actually, as you predicted, this gives us a chance to go back to the panelists' comments. I think this gets to Kori's question and her quest for a simple problem statement for the military today, for the US military. And notwithstanding the transition to great power competition, the reality is that the United States is still a global power. It has not withdrawn from that role, even though under this administration there have been some moves away from it, but we have not terminated that as our strategic outlook. That could change in the future, but until and unless it does, unfortunately, the problem statement for the US military is be prepared to do anything with very little notice. And again, the only way to do that is to prioritize adaptability above everything, because if you pick any point solution, conventional warfare, counterinsurgency, you know, cyber protection, whatever it is, if you pick a single point along an impossibly large spectrum, you're not just going to be wrong, but given the speed with which everything progresses, you could be catastrophically wrong. And so, you know, Kori, I endorse what you say, and that's, you know, part of what motivated the book is us looking out at, you know, this really unprecedented combination of technological change, of speed, and of having no clearly defined adversary that, you know, we're going to be focused on, because we could still, for all the talk of great power competition, we could still find ourselves, you know, somewhere else along the conflict spectrum. If I had told you on September 10th, 2001 that we'd be at war with Afghanistan the next week, I would have been laughed out of town. And, you know, the only certainty is that something like that could well happen again.
So we have a question about adaptability, and several of our panelists raised different kinds of questions about adaptability, including Richard's question as to what other types of adaptability did you consider and not pursue, and Kori's question about whether or not we should see it at a higher level. Daniel Gagliano asks, if only limited gains in adaptability can be made in the near future, at what level is adaptability most needed or most important?
Yeah, I would take my stab at that would be to reflect that we identified pretty clearly in the book, and several panelists have highlighted that the failures of adaptability, the most obvious glaring holes, aren't at the, you know, the tactical level, aren't at the forward edge of the battlefield, aren't at where, you know, tanks are fighting tanks. They're at the theater level, at the senior levels, the theater strategic levels, those who run the war from a particular theater. You know, we highlighted that in both Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think if I were to pick one, I think it would be at the institutional level. And I think that's back here in the United States, largely centered on the Pentagon. And it gets very much into, you know, Richard's comment about the bureaucracy versus the profession. The bureaucracy runs rampant in the United States of America, and it runs rampant in Washington, D.C. And the likelihood of that bureaucracy, and, you know, just to pick on our favorite tar baby out there, the acquisition process, that suddenly becoming adaptable in a war where the enemy is throwing new technology at us very quickly that we have to be able to respond to, or we find our technology that we're fighting with is inadequate to the task and has to be changed dramatically. There's almost nothing in our acquisition process that suggests we're going to be able to do that well before we fall off the cliff, before you reach sudden failure that you can't recover from, which is what adaptability is all about, being able to recover from your failures and do it as quickly as possible so that you can, you know, ultimately get on the offensive and prevail. So my target would be looking at the institutional level. That's both in, you know, the arena of technology, but in the arena of leadership, in the arena of doctrine. You know, I think the leadership and technology parts of this, the technology stories in this book at the institutional level are appalling, and they date back to almost identical case studies in World War II on institutional technological adaptation with U.S. tank development, for example, compared to, you know, what we saw with the MRAP and roadside bombs. So we could spend a lot of time looking at how we need to fix this back here, because if you know, no matter how good our tactical level commanders are and how good our, you know, warfighting capabilities are at the tactical level, if we can't adjust back here where you move the big levers strategy and of acquisition in adapting the technology you have, then we're going to fail.
Let me just expand on that a little bit more and refer back to one of the issues that I mentioned when I did my brief overview, because it helps get at this institutional level question quite directly, which I agree is absolutely where I think the most improvement is needed. There's this structural tension between the combatant commands and the services, and that can be really, really dysfunctional if you're in anything but the most urgent, all-out combat against a pure adversary. And this is one of the big dynamics we saw play out in Iraq and Afghanistan. The combatant commands represent the fight of today and maybe the fight of tomorrow, you know, in the very short term, right? They're thinking about current problems and trying to get support to those who are on the battlefield, you know, in the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, of overseeing the war fight. And their interests are in getting whatever technology capability, you know, into the hands of the warfighter as possible. What you found, though, is an incredible tension with the services who, by their very nature, by their charter, have to be thinking about tomorrow, right? In our system, the services role is to organize, train, and equip, right? That's the phrase. They organize, train, and equip the forces. And then when they're ready to fight, they ship them off to the combatant commanders who then conduct the war fights. Well, that gives the services a much longer time frame. A 10, 20, you know, year time frame out of, you know, and in the Air and Navy, much longer when you're talking about, you know, airplanes and ships and how long those can be in service. And so many of the institutional failures that we found in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars come down to the fact that the services didn't want to put any money or effort into the things that would help soldiers on the battlefield today because it threatened their long-term programs. Because they wanted to, for example, not buy life-saving MRAPs so that they could buy the JLTV, which, oh, by the way, and that debate goes back to, you know, the early 2000s, which, by the way, made its, you know, formal debut into the services only in the recent years, you know, over a decade later. So I agree with Richard that, you know, the more you have a professional latitude to exercise your judgment, the better. But the Pentagon is still a stifling bureaucracy. And in some cases, there is this necessary tension that very few people can resolve. Really, you know, it's only the president, the secretary of defense, and maybe the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And as we saw in the case of MRAPs, it took the personal intervention of Secretary Gates above the advice of all of his closest military advisors to get MRAPs fielded.
We have two more questions in this vein, so I'm going to actually ask them both. Dennis Murphy asks, given institutional and theater level barriers to adaptation, to what extent do you believe the political grand strategic aims of a particular war result in the preconditions for a failure to successfully adapt in a timely manner? And Peter Mansour wants to know, how does your work dovetail or differ from that of Williamson Murray, author of Military Adaptation in War, who has done the most impressive work to date on this topic?
Maybe I could take the first crack at that one. First, we are deeply intellectually indebted to Wick Murray for all of his work. We rely on it heavily. We use his stuff to teach. We think it's terrific. And we stole his definition of adaptability as being in wartime as opposed to innovation in peacetime, which is not universally agreed on. Those terms are still very contested, but you know, we shamelessly stole and cited, of course, his definition there. What Murray does, and I know, Pete, you're a historian as well, I think there's less attention paid to the more generalizable question. I hate to sound like a card-carrying political scientist, right? But into trying to figure out what becomes generalizable for the future. His work is incredibly historically rich, and it has implications for the future, of course. But I think in our work, we're trying to more focus on those, leaving the history telling to people like him and to you as well on that, to try to come up with some more general findings. I also wanted to address this question about, you know, at the political level and the grand strategy level, and this came up also during the panelists' comments. Yes, of course, it makes our failures at a strategic level in Afghanistan were manifold, and Iraq too, frankly, but in Afghanistan having, 19 commanders in 19 years, or slightly less than that. Not having a coherent strategy, there's no substitute for having a coherent strategy. However, you can separate out examples of good adaptability at the tactical and operational levels from the strategic level. Dave and I teach this as a course. We're currently teaching it now. And one of the things we've done in our weeks on World War I and World War II is we spent a lot of time on the incredible tactical and operational adaptability of the German military in both world wars. They did phenomenal things in terms of that are worthy of being emulated in terms of learning lessons, creating new doctrine, being innovative, sharing lessons learned. They, of course, did not win those wars. The tactical and operational adaptation was not enough to overcome flawed strategy, a horrible, purge in World War II, the horrible racial element of Hitler's plans, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to, make it say that these things are not connected. If you don't have a winning strategy, if you don't have a strategy in Afghanistan, you might not be able to win. But adaptability at the operational and tactical levels can be separated out to a certain extent for lessons to be learned. And certainly if you're not effective at adapting at those levels, you might have the best strategy, but if you're not getting feedback, if you're not learning how to fight differently, even a winning strategy may not be sufficient. It's certainly necessary, but it may not be sufficient.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on that is, number one, on Wick Murray, one other thing I think we bring to the table is a look at the last 10 or 15 years. Much of his work obviously is focused on prior to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we've actually taken a pretty good deep dive into each of those with some specific examples. So that kind of brings, in some ways, a lot of the work he has done in the past up to the present, which we thought was an important contribution to make. And I think on the war aims, we're still in the history of the Afghan war. The history of the Iraq war is a little bit of a different story, but we're still in the Afghan war. It's still being fought. The strategic aims, in the broadest brush terms, have remained somewhat similar to what they were after 9/11 in terms of averting attacks on the United States and not allowing Afghanistan to be a seedbed for terrorist attacks in the future. But within that, we've gone all over the map sheet in terms of how we intended to do that, whether we were going to win the war or simply sustain the effort, whether we were going to focus primarily on the Afghan military or cause the enemy to capitulate based on U.S. force of arms. So it has not been a case study in how to prosecute a long-term conflict. And part of that is in some ways, the broad generalities of the war aims are almost too broad, and that they weren't really narrowed enough for the military to take those on. So were those the seeds of a failure to adapt? In part, but I think there's also, and I'm kind of constitutionally focused on looking at what could military leaders have done, and myself being one of those over the years. And I think there's a lot of responsibility there to look at what could have been learned, what could have been done differently, what's, within that broad strategic guidance, could you have come up with a different approach that would have led to a better outcome? And I tend to think yes, and that obviously benefits from 20/20 hindsight, but I think that there are ways to mitigate that and to be able to grasp that sooner than at the end of a 20-year war.
I'm going to stay on this theme a little bit, although expand to a question from Dan Caldwell about connecting to Richard's question on civilian versus professional education. So how do you come out on Richard's question about civilian versus professional military education, considering the civilian graduate education of Admiral Crowell, General Petraeus, General McMaster, and Colonel Mansour? Civilian graduate education seemed to have contributed to thinking about adaptation. And if any of the other panelists, given the wealth of knowledge that we have here about civilian and professional military education, I invite anyone to comment on that. But we'll start with Nora and Dave.
Yeah, let me take the first shot at that. I generally agree with Richard that civilian advanced education should not come at the cost of military advanced education, but the reverse is true as well, is that military PME should not crowd out opportunities for civilian graduate school education. I'm a product of both. I have a master's from Georgetown, even though I'm at Johns Hopkins SAIS, which I get a lot of grief for on a regular basis. And I also am a graduate of the Army Command and Staff College and the Army War College. where Richard has been on the faculty for many years. And both of those add value. And had I lacked either one of those, it would have been a huge challenge for me, particularly doing one of the last chapters I had there, being commander in Afghanistan. But I have said to many audiences that the most important education I got from my last 10 years in the military was going to graduate school at Georgetown and being in a group of really bright people who didn't think the way I did, who didn't have the background I had, and taking demanding courses and having to write and think in ways that I never really was caused to do in the Army's professional military education system. The number of grad school opportunities from when I was a captain to today have gone like this because of the cost, largely. And so we've really reduced dramatically the amount of opportunities that rising leaders in all the services have to go out and get those top tier. And I'm not talking about PhDs. I'm not particularly a fan of sending military officers for PhD programs unless there's a specific reason to do that. But master's programs, 2 years master's programs, especially in high-end civilian education programs, where they're immersed in groups of people that are not like them, that are going to go off to the State Department and to the National Security Council and the Pentagon civilian positions or defense industry, not to the 82nd Airborne Division for their next job. They need that experience, and they don't get that sitting in a war college classroom or a command and staff college classroom.
Yeah, I agree with that. The curriculum is not the same, nor should it be the same, but it isn't, one is not a substitute for the other. And I think, as Dave said, the ability for officers to go to civilian graduate school has been just slashed. I think part of that reason has been the move to offer accredited master's degrees at the PME institutions, which may or may not be right for the military content of their programs, but that is not equivalent to a civilian master's degree in any way, shape, or form. It is not as rigorous. It does not have the same tests and requirements, and it also does not, expose people to those who are unlike them and force them to wrestle with broader strategic questions the way that civilian peers and people who have the leading scholars in the field who are at civilian institutions, they need to be exposed to that. So again, that's not inherently a criticism of PME, but PME is trying to do too much, and it is trying to fill that master's degree quality level thinking, which is not equivalent to doing it at a civilian university. That's the problem.
So Jim, I also want to
go ahead. Yes,
if I may.
Yes.
Because the 5 or 6 guys listed in the question are such outliers on the distribution curve that you shouldn't build a system around those people. And the American military doesn't have the liberty to build its personnel systems around the top 3% of the distribution curve. That's why who you bring into the force matters so much, because the middle of the bell curve is where the personnel policies get built and where it should get built, right? The Army isn't Google. It doesn't have the same intake of talent. It has different needs than Google has. And so we shouldn't be apologetic about personnel policies that are different from the country's most innovative and also some of the country's least ethical organizations. We're trying to do something different than that in the military. But the challenge is, how do you give folks enough exposure without losing them for the profession? Because I think, to add on to Nora's point, one of the other reasons that the military has cut way back on civilian graduate education is that those people promptly leave military service. And so taxpayers are investing in the transition programs for the most capable people in the military talent pool, and that doesn't seem quite fair either. So it's not a particularly easy problem to solve, and I think it gets solved best by bringing more innovative people into the talent pool, people who have connections outside of the mainstream of the military experience. And that means recruiting greater diversity into the force and selecting for diversity as a positive good.
I just also wanted to mention, and I think Richard has something he'd like to say as well, but I just wanted to not lose sight when Dave talks about what he gained from being in the program at Georgetown. I also do imagine that his classmates and his professors also gained from having him in that program. And we shouldn't forget that in these graduate programs at the Georgetowns and SAISes and at SIS, what it means. I know from my standpoint as a professor, having military students in the classroom is a tremendous learning experience for me. And I think, you know, as we talk about divides between civilian and military, having folks in the same classroom is very important. I also think we should try to be more creative about partnerships. We talked with Quantico when I was Dean of SIS about doing, you know, a partnership that I think sort of developed in a very limited way. And I mean, now we know what it means for all of us to be online. When we launched our online graduate degree in the spring of 2013, I mean, we now have more than 300 students in those online master's programs at SIS. This is different from the on-campus programs that are now online. This is the online that's meant to be online. You know, more than 300 students in those programs now, and more than a third are U.S. military, either active duty or veterans, and you know, students having the opportunity to be in that kind of a classroom environment, even on a deployment. And you know, even if that changes during the course of the program. And so I think there are ways that we can try to bring these streams together. And maybe, you know, as we look at things that we can take out of this pandemic, as more and more places now have experience doing things online as well as on campus, thinking about how to build these partnerships. But Richard, I believe you had something you wanted to say.
Just two things. Actually, I did mark that part in the text where you talk about advanced civil schooling. And I haven't gone back to check the numbers myself, but I would challenge it a bit in that I was part of something about 15 years ago when we looked and we realized we were down to, out of a cohort of senior captains and majors, about 20% were going to advanced civil schooling, but mainly to go teach at West Point and other direct utilization afterwards. We put together a program that was approved to go to 50%, meaning essentially 1,000 majors a year. So that'd be about 50% of a cohort to advanced civil schooling in the sort of 8 to 12 year point. If we're at 700, then we're probably more like at 40% right now. That's really high. And if I would to add in, having watched our students come through the War College, it's a distinct minority that show up here without a civilian graduate degree. Now, I only mentioned the ones that were funded by the Army, as opposed to many who went on their own. And I see one of the comments from Pete Mansour is that, you know, the idea that West Point sort of sent you early on, that timing is about right. I did my master's degree at Princeton as a captain and parlayed it into a PhD a few years afterwards on my own. The Army didn't send me to that part. And then I went to CGSC at the Naval War College, and then I went to the Army War College. And I will tell you that they were not great substitutes. So examples of learning Clausewitz as an IR or Thucydides as an IR thing is completely different as learning it as a strategist. And so the war colleges were tremendously helpful in preparing me for that. So that's why I say they're complementary. I wouldn't give up either part of my education. And I think it's a good model. And so I'm an advocate for more advanced civil schooling and for ways to replicate pieces of it inside our programs. We go to New York City, for example, to not talk to anybody in the military. And to take them into the media and the economic and finance world, so they see that, and the UN missions from their parts, not the embassies to the U.S. So there's ways to do that broadening without necessarily getting the full immersion, which I still concur is very, very powerful. But I will say, if I made it a plug, I did talk about war colleges versus civilian in a debate with Rich Hooker in an issue of Parameters that came out about 6 months ago, called Debate on the War Colleges. He essentially advocates for a sort of more civilian approach. I disagree a bit, not to reject it completely, but I kind of make the case for the war colleges. So if you want to see kind of where I think where the war colleges need to refine, but I think where their strengths are compared to some of the civilian programs, that just sort of extends why they're complementary and not substitutes for one another.
Jim, if I could jump in, I want to tie a couple of themes together and go back to a question actually that Karl raised. I think we all on the panel, certainly we in the book, do talk about leadership as the most important of the three, because it's people that ultimately make up the military and ultimately make the military function, right? And it is people who end up making decisions about doctrine and technology. So you need leaders. I think we all agree on that. And for that, you need to dramatically improve talent management, Kori, exactly as you said. And we give, a lot of credit to the Army for the things they are doing in that. Again, our assessment is it's too early to tell, but we think those are on the right track, and our fingers are crossed that they succeed. But in line with what you're talking about, the need for a broader talent management approach, and one of the reasons why it's hard to go get time off for purely civilian schooling goes back to something that Karl said in his comments, right? Which is the timeline for a military career hasn't changed in decades, right? It no longer makes sense to have a 20-year sort of cutoff where retirement is expected and you need to, or available, and you need to hit every single wicket for command and for upward potential to be a general officer by the year 20. Military careers used to only go until, 27 to 30 years if you were talking about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, right? Today, if you're chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you've probably been in uniform for 40 plus. I think General Dunford had 42 years of service when he retired. So I'm not arguing specifically about, when do retirement benefits vest. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about retirement. I mean that, the members of the military who serve the longest will be in uniform for over 40 years. There should be plenty of time in that overall 40-year career to extend the time at different grades to be able to enable some of these broadening experiences, which Karl rightly points out. If you try to get in even just civilian schooling on top of your PME, that can take you off the promotion track because you won't be competitive with your peers. We need to be thinking creatively about all sorts of things that help create the most dynamic, adaptive, innovative leaders and build that in throughout the talent development pipeline, and stop thinking of, well, if we add anything, we have to trade it off because we only have 20 years to get all of that stuff in.
Could I add one last point though? I think it's to Karl's also, because you mentioned that his comment was about the Air Force. And I know, having done this for a while on the Army side, that we get a lot of comments from Air Force, Navy, and Marine officers who envy what the Army does. And say, without having looked at their numbers exactly, my sense is their careers, there is less tolerance in their personnel systems for advanced civil schooling than the Army has built it. I still think the Army should do more. But I think if you compare the services, there's probably, the other services are probably well behind where the Army is.
I think one comment on that too. I think that there's a risk out there that can get concealed when you look at the aggregate numbers. And I'll take the Army here as a case in point. The number of fully funded graduate positions in the Army tend to be tied to being in a specialty that requires a graduate degree. If your specialty, and the Army is earning off personnel system that's been in existence for about 30 years now, the current model. And it tracks people basically by operational career fields or all others. So operational career fields being the infantry, armor, field artillery, the people that are going to go on to command are in those career fields. They don't have built-in graduate programs in the civilian institutional world like all of the other specialties almost to a fault do. And so if you are going to one of those programs, you're going to be a specialist in space, you're going to be an Army strategist, you're going to be a foreign area officer, you're going to have a fully funded graduate program, and everybody in those programs that stays in them generally does that. If you're going to be a commander, if you're going to be the brigade commander of the 2nd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division, and you're going to be the seedbed for future generals, you're not going to have one of those slots. And so your ability to get to civilian graduate school, even though you're on the biggest track to generalship, is much, much smaller than someone who's a specialist in one of these other fields. And so there's a baked-in problem in terms of, I used to joke that every time somebody chooses to go to the Army strategist field out of the infantry career field or armor career field, the IQ of battalion commanders in those fields drops by 3 points. And so eventually all the commanders are going to be the least educated people we have out there in the Army. And that's the wrong direction to be going in.
We just have a few minutes left. I want to read the 3 questions that remain, and then Nora and Dave, you get the last word. There was a question from John Alexander related to something Nora was just talking about, which is what happens when national leadership is unstable or fails. can the disparate positions being taken, consider the disparate positions being taken publicly by very senior former leaders. There's a question from Mark Terrell about what effect you think 3D printing might have on, at the tactical and operational level if each company had their own 3D printer, and would that be useful at the company level? And then James Harai, the special operations community with its unique funding was intended to be more adaptive than the services for the reasons that you have for writing your book. Are there lessons from that experiment? So you can take any of those and fold in, but whatever final comments you have here in our remaining few minutes, please.
Great. Let me tackle a couple of those first. First, onto the question about 3D printing. Boy, I was smiling when you read off that question, Jim, because that was one of the final arguments we had about the recommendations chapter, is we had included a recommendation to field 3D printers down to very small unit levels. And between when we first drafted that and when we were ready to send the book in for publication, it turned out the services had made so much progress on that that we didn't think we could include it as a recommendation anymore because they were going in the right direction. And so that got ejected from the manuscript for being a little bit overtaken by events. The advent of 3D printing is game-changing, you know, especially to foster adaptation on the battlefield, to allow troops, you know, in localized areas to be able to print out what they need is tremendous. And so the more of that, the better. But as I said, we were so happy with the direction of progress on that we didn't think it was worth pointing out in our recommendations. Also on the question about special operations, there's lots to be learned from special operations, but going back to Kori's point about the bell curve, you know, a lot of the things that make special operations so special and so adaptable almost by definition cannot work in the big army, the big services, because they rely on a very elite level of selection, of training, of more maturity, and you know, all of that, and you know, in some cases more than a year-long selection process going into that. So you know, adaptability is one of the hallmarks of special forces, and certainly there are some lessons to be learned there, but you can't replicate all of the conditions that make them so adaptable in the bigger standard army or other services.
Yeah, I'll just add to that as well. And I may take a slightly different outlook on special operations community there. I think they tend to be the leading indicator on a lot of things. They're putting a lot of investment into adaptability and thinking about that in advance of what the services are doing. And I salute Jim Harai, who's a veteran of that community out there at the Asia Pacific Center in Hawaii, and wish we were out there with you here today, who asked the question. But I think as SOF continues to look at how they're going to face some unique challenges now with major power competition, in addition to having all the other wars still ongoing, they're looking very carefully at a whole range of pretty creative ways to make sure that their human domain is prepared for these conflicts as possible. So I think there may be some things to watch there. I think the services pay pretty close attention to that as well, but SOF is incentivized because they are so small and they do have a lot of authorities and they have organizational advantages that some of the other services don't.
Well, this was an incredibly rich discussion. Again, so excited to see Adaptation Under Fire out and ready. Richard, I'm pretty sure that Oxford University Press is counting on the PMEs to assign this book throughout the curriculum across the land. So hopefully we'll see it getting a lot of use and a lot of discussion. Richard, Kori, and Karl, really grateful to you for your excellent comments and insights. And Dave and Nora, congratulations. We're really excited for you. And we wish you much success with the book. And we wish everyone safety and well-being throughout the rest of the pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all very much.
Again. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Well done.